This is the Dead Sea Scrolls explained in 10 or so minutes. And don't worry if you're interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's going to be plenty more about that coming from this channel. But let's try to wrap it all up in about 10 minutes or so. The Dead Sea Scrolls is the name given to the collection of scrolls found in pottery jars that were carefully placed in the caves along the Dead Sea region of southern Israel. The scrolls were first discovered in 1947 by a young Bedouin shepherd who stumbled upon the scrolls quite accidentally while tending to his sheep. In the years and decades that followed, they achieved worldwide acclaim as some of the earliest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible that we've ever discovered, and some more secrets lay within them as well. The Dead Sea Scrolls seem to have been the scroll collection that belonged to the monastery of Khirbet Qumran, a very nearby site that was built on the Dead Sea by a group of sectarians who split off from the rest of the Israelite religious system of the time. The monastery was established sometime around 100 BC and it continued to operate until its destruction around 70 AD, so about 170 years of total operations. The people who occupied the site of Khirbet Qumran were dissidents from the current regime going on in Judea at the time. At this point in history, Judea was independent, at least temporarily, from Greek or Roman rule. The current ruling family was the Hasmonean dynasty, also known sometimes more popularly as the Maccabean dynasty. The current ruler at the time of the sectarians' departure was Alexander Jannaeus, a man who was known for his violent tendencies and rather disagreeable nature. During the reign of this dislikable king, a group of priests called the Zadokite priesthood in Jerusalem itself believed themselves to be the only valid priesthood available to the Israelites at this time. And seeing as they were not the ones in charge of operations of the temple in Jerusalem, they departed into the desert to build a substitute temple for themselves at the site of Khirbet Qumran, and thus the sectarian movement began. Modern scholarship generally recognizes these sectarians as a part of a wider movement called Essenes. When Flavius Josephus, the great Jewish historian of the 1st century AD, talks about the different philosophical schools of Judaism, he breaks it down to three different schools: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, both of which are familiar to us from the New Testament of the Bible, and the final one being the Essenes. We'll talk about the Essenes in their own video because they deserve more time than what I can afford them here, but the writings at the School of Khirbet Qumran seem to align enough with Josephus and other descriptions of the Essenes to warrant the identification of the sectarians at Khirbet Qumran, and thus the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, as part of the Essene movement. Now let's return to the scrolls, because as I said, the scrolls found in the jars buried in the caves along the Dead Sea seem to have been the library of this monastery. They were likely moved to these caves to avoid their capture and destruction by the Romans, and it appears that the Essenes of Qumran weren't the only ones to have this idea. Deposits of later scrolls at Nahal Heber, Wadi Mirabaat, and scrolls from the Masada settlement in the same area from a later time and from different people suggest that it was a relatively common practice to hide one's documents from an invading force to prevent their destruction. As far as the contents of the library itself and the things written down on the scrolls, I'm going to break it down into three different categories. The first is biblical manuscripts. These are manuscript copies of the Bible either made by the scribes of Qumran or imported from outside of the monastery for use among the community itself. The second category is sectarian documents. These would be documents written by the scribes of Qumran themselves without intending to publish them to the wider world. These were to be used for internal use only. Finally, there are going to be external documents. These are documents that were widely published and populated in the broader world that were also either imported to Qumran or were copied at Qumran by earlier exemplars. The biblical manuscripts that we found among the Dead Sea Scrolls are the earliest complete manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible that we possess, and they're almost 1,000 years earlier than our next earliest complete exemplar called the Aleppo Codex. In addition to Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, we also discovered that there were Aramaic translations or paraphrases of the Bible found among the scrolls, as well as Greek translations that were in wide use at this time as well. Essentially, it seems that they wanted as many different translations of their biblical texts available to them as possible, similar to how a modern Christian might have a KJV, an ESV, and an NIV, even though it's all the same Bible at the end of the day. Next, there's the category of the sectarian documents. The sectarian documents were written for internal use within the community itself. This is probably why we don't see them published more broadly, and that's why they don't show up in the manuscript traditions of later cultures. They were meant to be used only by the sectarians, and thus we don't have any copies of them from outside of this place. Which means if these copies had perished, we would never really know the internal machinations of this community. The sectarian documents can vary widely by genre. They can be as simple and dry as lists of rules that the community had to follow, like in the community rule, and they can be as interesting as the apocalyptic speculation found in several other fragments. Basically, anything that was written by the Qumranites for the Qumranites counts as a sectarian document. Finally, we have the category of non-sectarian documents. These are documents that don't have the same flavor as the sectarian documents, and thus it seems unlikely that they were used exclusively by the school of Khirbet Qumran, and yet they aren't Bible manuscripts either. So these are pieces of literature or other documents that were imported to the community from the broader world. These include examples like the Book of Enoch, which bears many similarities to the sectarian documents of Khirbet Qumran, but is sufficiently distinct enough to suggest that it wasn't written by those people. It probably existed for some time before the Qumranites wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. Other examples include wisdom literature, novels, stories, various apocrypha, and even several technical documents talking about the course of the stars. So now let's talk a little bit more about the Dead Sea Scrolls and their relationship to early Christianity, because there's a lot of opinions out there, and a lot of these opinions were seen as valid in the very early days of scholarship on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Essentially, when the first wave of research came out about the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a big hubbub about possible implications for Christianity, and a lot of people threw a lot of theories out there. But it's been several decades since all that's happened, and so we've had time to reflect, to meditate, to put together paradigms and challenge those paradigms. And so I'm going to be succinct here in explaining sort of the major takeaways we can draw from them. Essentially, we can safely conclude that the kind of Judaism reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls is closer to early Christianity than some other examples of ancient Jewish literature, like the rabbinic texts or the Alexandrian texts. All the same, it doesn't seem likely that Jesus himself or early Christianity had any direct ties to the monastery of Khirbet Qumran, or were particularly influenced by the writings of the sectarian documents. Now, that being said, there are a couple places where there might be detectable contact. Primarily, these are the person of John the Baptist, whom some scholars think spent time at the community of Khirbet Qumran, and the other being the Gospel of John, the fourth Gospel of the New Testament and one of the latest biographies written about Jesus. The Gospel of John shares several broad strokes similarities to the sectarian documents found at Qumran, but more recently, scholars have noted that John lacks the technical terminology that would define the author as a part of the Qumran community, and so it seems unlikely that John was a direct part of the community that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, but he may have walked in similar circles to them, again, possibly from that broader movement of the scenes. And that was our primer to the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you like this sort of more short-form content, then feel free to let me know in the comments, and I can make more of these brief introductions to various topics. In the meantime, hope everybody had a great day. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you all next time.